Get comfortable. Let the day settle. Let your breathing slow, and let the noise of the modern world fade back until it is very far away. Tonight, we are going to a house, a very large house in the English countryside, on a still afternoon in the year 1885. And we are going to spend a long, unhurried while inside it, learning how it truly worked. There is nothing to solve and nowhere to be. Just the house and the two very different worlds it held under one roof, and the whole slow machinery of a life that has almost entirely vanished. Here is what you have probably pictured, if you have pictured a great country house at all. A long gravel drive, a beautiful stone front with many windows, a family of leisure inside, the ladies in their morning rooms, the gentlemen out with their dogs and guns, tea on the lawn, dinner by candlelight, a life of ease and grace unfolding in beautiful rooms while the light moves across the parkland outside. And all of that is real, and we will see it. But it is only half of the house. It is the half that was meant to be seen. The other half is the one we are really here for, and it is the half the family themselves barely knew. Because a house like this did not run on grace. It ran on an enormous, hidden, ceaseless engine of human labor, an entire second population living inside the same walls, rising in the dark, working the whole day through, and moving about the house by their own separate stairs and passages, so that the family need never see them at their work. The beautiful, effortless life upstairs was produced hour by hour by dozens of people the family stepped past without seeing. That is the hidden life of the title. Not a scandal, not a secret in the melodramatic sense, but something far larger and stranger. A whole working world folded invisibly into a house of leisure, kept deliberately out of sight, and almost forgotten now. There is no need to hold on to anything as we go. You do not have to remember the names of things, or keep track of who is who, or follow any thread too closely. Let the details wash over you as they come. If your attention drifts, let it drift. If you fall asleep before we reach the end, which is rather the idea, the house will still be there, going quietly about its hidden work, whether you are following or not. This is meant to be a place to rest, not a lesson to sit through. And the surest way to enjoy it is to let go and let the words carry you wherever they go. If you would like more nights like this, quiet journeys into vanished worlds, you might subscribe, and you might tell me in a comment which house, real or imagined, you would most like to spend a night inside. And then let the room grow dim, and let us walk up that gravel drive together and go inside. It is a warm, still afternoon in the late spring of 1885. The house stands where it has stood for generations, a great pile of pale stone in a green fold of the country, with a park around it, and gardens, and beyond them the farms and cottages and woods of the estate. From the front, approached up the drive, it is all serenity. Tall windows catch the afternoon light. A shallow flight of steps rises to a great door. The lawns are cut close and green. There is bird song, and the far sound of a mower somewhere, and very little else. It looks like the most peaceful place on earth. Walk around it, though, to the side, to the back, and the house changes. Here the architecture becomes plainer, more workmanlike. Here are the doors nobody grand ever uses, the yards and the outbuildings, the kitchen court, the stable court, the low windows of the rooms below the level of the grand floors. Here, if you came at the right hour, you would see the real traffic of the house, the tradesmen's carts, the baskets of vegetables coming up from the gardens, the coal, the laundry, the endless coming and going of people in plain clothes carrying things. The front of the house was built to be looked at. The back of the house was built to work, and it worked without stopping. Let us settle the situation before we go in, because who you are in this house changes everything you see. Tonight, unusually, you are not going to be only one person. We are going to move between the two worlds of the house, upstairs and down, because the whole point of this house, the thing that makes it worth understanding, is the relationship between those two worlds. And you cannot see that from inside only one of them. So sometimes tonight you will be of the family, moving through the beautiful rooms, and sometimes you will be of the staff, moving through the hidden ones, and the strangeness of the house is exactly the strangeness of how little those two experiences of the same building had in common. The family who own this house are landed gentry, an old family of the kind that formed the backbone of rural England in this century. They are wealthy, though wealthy in land more than in ready money, which matters, as we will see. The head of the family holds the estate, the house, and the land and the farms, and lives from what the land brings in. His wife runs the household, which is a larger task than that word suggests. There are children and a governess for the younger ones, and the whole apparatus of a great family's life. But the family, all told, are perhaps a handful of people. And to keep those few people in the style their position demanded took an establishment of dozens. Here is the thing most people get wrong about a house like this, and it is worth stopping on before we go a step further, because it overturns the whole picture. The life of the family looks like the point of the house. The family look like the reason it all exists. But in terms of sheer human effort, of hours worked and tasks done and people employed, the family were almost a small part of what went on inside their own walls. The great fact of the country house was not the leisure of the few. It was the labor of the many that produced it. On a large estate, there might be 30, 40, even more people at work, indoors and out, to maintain the household and the grounds. The house was less a home than a small institution, a self-contained working world with a population, a hierarchy, an economy, and a daily routine of its own, most of which the family never witnessed and did not need to understand, because its whole design was to deliver comfort to them, while hiding from them the machinery that made it. So that is what we are going to do tonight. We are going to see both halves. The beautiful, visible life of the family, yes, but chiefly the hidden life beneath and behind it. The engine room of the country house. The world of the people who made it run. We will meet the hierarchy that governed them, stricter in its way than anything upstairs. We will follow the day from the dark morning when the first of them rose to the late night when the last of them slept. We will go out into the gardens and the stables and the home farm and see how the estate fed and supplied itself. And we will keep returning to the one strange truth at the center of it all. The two worlds under one roof, joined by bells and back stairs, and kept always carefully apart. The afternoon is warm and still. The front of the house dreams in the sun. and behind it, out of sight, the great engine is running, as it runs every day, and we are about to go and stand inside it. Come in by the side door, the one the family never use. That is where the real house begins. The day in a house like this does not begin with the family. It begins hours earlier, in the dark, in the cold, at the top of the house and the bottom of it, with the people whose entire working life was arranged around a single principle. The house must be ready before the family see it. Whatever labor that took, it had to be finished and invisible by the time the first of the family opened their eyes. So we begin before dawn, in the attics, under the slates, where the lowest of the servants slept. These are the rooms nobody grand ever entered, small and bare, tucked under the roof, hot in summer and bitter in winter, reached by the back stairs that ran up through the house like a hidden spine. Here, in the last of the dark, the housemaids wake, because the day's first work is theirs, and it is heavy, and it must be done before the house stirs. There is no lingering. A maid who overslept threw the whole morning behind, and the whole morning had been arranged, task by task, to fit into the hours before the family came down. Consider what the first hours actually held, because this is where the hidden life is at its most hidden and its most relentless. The fires. A house like this was warmed and served by open fires. Many of them in the principal rooms and the bedrooms. And every one of those fires had to be cleaned out, laid and lit before the room was used. So in the cold dark, the housemaid goes from grate to grate, and at each one she kneels and rakes out yesterday's ashes and cleans the hearth and blacks the iron of the grate and lays the new fire and lights it and moves on, her hands filthy, her knees sore, a heavy box of coal and cleaning things carried with her from room to room. The drawing room, the dining room, the morning room, the library, and then, as the family's waking hour approached, the bedroom fires, so that when a lady of the house woke, her room was already warm, the fire already burning, as if it had simply always been so. She would never see it done. It was done in the dark by a girl she barely knew, and it was only the first of the morning's tasks. Because while the fires were being lit, the rest of the ground floor had to be brought to order. The rooms the family would use had to be cleaned before they used them, and a great house held a great deal of cleaning, carpets swept. And in these years, that meant on hands and knees with a brush and dustpan, or with damp tea leaves scattered to catch the dust, for the mechanical carpet sweeper was only beginning to appear, and the vacuum cleaner did not yet exist. Grates blacked, fenders polished, furniture dusted, mirrors and windows cleaned, the hall floor swept and washed, the front steps scrubbed. Every hard surface the family would touch or see had to be made clean and bright every day by hand before the family came to it. And all of this heavy, dirty, early work fell to the lower servants, the housemaids, and the kitchen maids, and the hall boy, the youngest and the poorest and the least regarded people in the entire establishment, doing the roughest work at the coldest, darkest hour, so that others could wake to warmth and order. There is a phrase worth holding on to here, because it captures the whole strange arrangement. The ideal servant, in the mind of the age, was invisible, not merely quiet, not merely discreet, but as close to unseen as a working human being could be made. The perfect housemaid did her work and vanished, leaving behind only the result, the lit fire, the clean room, the polished floor, with no trace of the hands that had done it. Some great houses were actually built to enforce this. There were hidden passages and separate staircases specifically, so that servants could move about the house, doing their work without ever crossing the family's path. A maid who found herself about to meet a member of the family in a corridor was, in some households, expected to turn and face the wall or step into a doorway until they had passed. The labor was to be total, and the laborer was to be as near to nothing as possible. You made the house run, and in return you were asked, in a sense, to disappear. Meanwhile, below, the kitchen has been awake as long as the maids, because the kitchen never truly rested. The kitchen maid was often the first person in the whole house to rise, before even the housemaids, because the kitchen range had to be got going before anything else could happen. That range, the great iron cooking stove that was the heart of the kitchen, had to be cleaned out and blacked and lit and brought up to heat. And this too was slow, dirty work done in the dark. And until it was hot, there was no hot water, no cooking, no breakfast, nothing. So the kitchen maid rose first and lit the fire that the whole house depended on, and set the water to heat, and began the long day's work of feeding not only the family, but the entire population of the house, upstairs and down, which was a far larger task than feeding the family alone. By the time the sky is graying toward dawn, then, the house is already deep into its working day, though not one member of the family has stirred. The fires are lit, the rooms are being cleaned, the range is hot, the water heating, the first food beginning. The whole visible house is being quietly assembled, made ready, brought to the state of warm, effortless order in which the family would find it, as though it had arranged itself. And the people doing all of this have already been at work for an hour or two in the cold, and will not stop, most of them, until long after the family have gone to bed that night. Their day is bounded not by the clock, but by the family's day, stretching from before the family woke to after the family slept, so that the leisured day upstairs floated on a working day downstairs that was longer at both ends. This is the foundation of everything else we will see tonight. So let it settle before we go on. The country house presented itself as a place of natural ease, where comfort simply existed, where fires burned and rooms gleamed and meals appeared, as if the house produced them of its own accord. It produced nothing of its own accord. Every warm room was a fire someone had knelt to light in the dark. Every clean floor was an hour on someone's knees. Every meal was a labor begun before dawn. The ease was real, but it was not natural. It was manufactured continuously by people who had agreed, in exchange for their food and their bed and their small wage, to manufacture it and then to vanish. And now, with the house waking and the family about to come down into the warm, ordered world that has been made for them, let us go and meet the people who made it and see how they were ranked and ruled and held in their places. Come down now, properly, into the working half of the house, because to understand the hidden life you have, to understand that it was not a crowd. It was a hierarchy, as ordered and as conscious of rank as anything in the family's world above, and in some ways more so. The servants of a great house were not simply a mass of people who did the work. They were a society, with an aristocracy and a working class of its own, with titles and precedents and privileges and slights, and every single person in it knew exactly where they stood, and exactly who stood above and below them. At the top of this world, in a house of this size, stood two people, and between them they ruled the entire establishment. The butler ruled the men, and the housekeeper ruled the women, and together they governed the house below stairs, as the master and mistress governed it above. These were the upper servants, the senior staff, and their authority over the people beneath them was real and daily, and largely unquestioned. The butler was the most senior man in the house. He commanded the male servants, the footman, and the hall boy, and the rest. And he held responsibility for some of the most trusted things in the household. The wine cellar was his, and the wine cellar in a house like this was a thing of real value, so its keys hung with the butler and no one else. The silver was his care, the cleaning and counting and safekeeping of it. He oversaw the service of dinner, that great nightly performance, directing the footman, presenting the wine, ensuring that the whole ceremony ran without a visible flaw. He was often the person who engaged and dismissed the lower male servants. And for all this, he was paid, in a house of this standing, something in the region of £40 to £60 a year, a wage that placed him far above the servants below him. Though still, it is worth noting, below what the family might spend on a single evening's entertaining. He dressed well. He carried himself with dignity, and to the lower servants he was a figure of considerable power. Beside him, equal in authority over her own domain, stood the housekeeper. She commanded the female staff, the housemaids, and still room maids, and the rest, and she held the keys, and the keys mattered enormously, because they were the physical sign of trust and control. The housekeeper kept the keys to the store cupboards, the linen presses, the china closet, the still room where preserves and medicines and delicate things were kept. She ordered the household supplies and kept the accounts of them, guarding against waste and theft, because a great house consumed a great deal, and someone had to account for all of it. She trained and disciplined the maids. She was, very often, addressed as Mrs., whether or not she had ever married, a courtesy title that marked her rank, and she wore no uniform, because her position was above the wearing of one. When the family were away, she frequently stayed and held the house. She was, in short, the mistress of the hidden half of the house, and a young housemaid feared and obeyed her the way a junior officer obeys a commander. Below these two, but still among the upper servants, came a few others whose positions carried status, even though they served the family directly. The cook, who in a house without a grand chef held enormous responsibility, feeding the whole establishment day after day, and answerable for the family's table and health and reputation as hosts, a position of such trust and skill that a good cook was valued and well paid, and not lightly parted with. The lady's maid, who attended the mistress personally, dressed her and cared for her clothes and hair, and who by her closeness to the family and her refined duties ranked above the ordinary housemaids. The valet, who did the same for the master. These upper servants did not do the rough work. That was beneath their station. They directed it, or they performed the skilled and personal tasks that the lower servants were not trusted with, And then, beneath all of these, came the great body of the staff, who actually did the heavy labor, the lower servants, the ones we met in the dark this morning, lighting the fires. The housemaids, ranked among themselves from the head housemaid down to the youngest under housemaid who did the cleaning of the house. The kitchen maid and the scullery maid who did the endless washing and scrubbing and preparing beneath the cook. The scullery maid, lowest of all, up to her elbows in greasy water all day, scouring the pots and pans and dishes that a great house dirtied in staggering numbers. The footmen, the young men in livery, who served at table and carried and fetched and answered the door and the bells. The hall boy, the lowest of the males, a lad who did whatever rough work was handed down to him. These were the people whose labor actually produced the running of the house. And they were paid the least, worked the hardest, rose the earliest, and slept the latest, and stood at the very bottom of a hierarchy that reminded them of their place at every hour of the day. Here is something that surprises people, and it is one of the truest and strangest facts of the hidden life. That hierarchy below stairs was not merely a matter of who gave orders. It governed everything, including the smallest daily things, and the servants themselves enforced it as fiercely as anyone. Consider the servants' own meals, taken at their own table in the servants' hall. Even there, at their own dinner, rank ruled absolutely. The upper servants and the lower servants might begin the meal together. But in many houses, the senior servants, the butler and housekeeper, and their peers, would rise part way through and withdraw to the housekeeper's room to finish the meal in their own dignified company, leaving the lower servants behind. The food was served in order of rank. The lower servants waited on the upper ones. The youngest ate last. A newly arrived scullery maid learned within days that she was at the very bottom not only of the family's world, but of the servants' world too. That there were people in plain clothes eating at the same table who outranked her, as surely as the master outranked them all. Why was it like this? Why did people with so little, doing such hard work, maintain among themselves a hierarchy as rigid as the one that held them all down? Partly because the whole age believed in hierarchy, believed that a well-ordered world was a ranked world, and the servants had absorbed that belief as fully as their masters. Partly because rank, below stairs, was almost the only reward available. A housemaid could not become wealthy, but she could rise, from under housemaid to head housemaid, and perhaps in time to housekeeper. And each step up was a real gain in status and wages and dignity in the only world she had. The hierarchy gave the hidden life its shape and its ambitions. It was a ladder, and a hard one, but it was a ladder, and for a young person in service, it was very nearly the only ladder there was. So when you look at the working half of the house, do not see a crowd of interchangeable servants. See a whole society, ranked from the butler in his dignity down to the scullery maid at her sink. Every one of them knowing precisely where they stood. Every one of them owing deference above, and, if they were lucky enough to have anyone below them, receiving it in turn. This was the hidden kingdom, and it had its own crown, its own court, and its own long climb from the bottom. Now, let us watch it at work, as the family's day begins upstairs, and the demands begin to fall. Now the family begin to wake. and with them wakes the strangest and most ingenious feature of the whole house, the system by which the two worlds spoke to each other without meeting. Because the family and the servants lived in the same building, but they did not share it. They moved through it by different routes, occupied different parts of it, and met only at the precise moments when the family required to be served. The rest of the time, the servants were meant to be elsewhere, out of sight, available but invisible. And the thing that made this possible, the nervous system of the entire house, was the bells. Listen for them, because once you notice the bells, you understand the house. Throughout the family's part of the house, in every principal room and every bedroom, there was a bell pull, a handle, or a cord that a member of the family could reach without rising from their chair. And when they pulled it, a wire ran through the walls, along the passages, down into the working part of the house, to a board in or near the servants' hall, where a row of bells hung, each one labelled with the room it answered. The bell rang and swung, and by which bell was ringing, the servants knew instantly which room required attention. A footman, or whichever servant the summons fell to, would then leave the servants' quarters, climb the back stairs, cross into the family's world, and present himself to be told what was wanted, and then withdraw again to fetch or do it. Stop and consider what that system actually accomplished, because it is the physical expression of the whole social arrangement. It meant the family never had to seek out a servant. They never had to go below stairs, never had to raise their voice, never had to know where any servant was or what any servant was doing. They simply pulled a cord, and a person appeared, as if summoned out of the air, and did what was needed, and vanished again. The servant, for their part, was bound to the bell. Wherever they were, whatever they were doing, the bell could ring, and they had to go. Their time was not their own. It was strung all day, between one summons and the next, and the bellboard in the servants' hall, with its ranked and labelled bells, was, in a sense, the truest map of the house, because it showed exactly how the whole building was wired to deliver the family's smallest wish to a waiting servant, instantly, at any hour. The architecture itself was built around this separation, and once you see it, you cannot unsee it. The grand rooms, the ones the family used, occupied the best of the house, the principal floors, the sunniest aspects, the finest views. The service rooms, the working half, were pushed to the back, or below, or into a wing of their own, plainer, darker, arranged for function rather than beauty, and running between the two, threading through the whole structure, were the servants' routes, the back stairs and the service passages and the concealed doors, so that a servant could travel from the kitchen to a bedroom, from the cellar to the dining room, without ever passing through the spaces the family used. In the very grandest houses, this was carried to remarkable lengths, whole networks of tunnels and hidden corridors, so that the labor of the house could flow through it unseen. The building was designed, quite deliberately, to keep the two populations apart, to let one be served by the other, without the two ever quite occupying the same space, except on the family's terms. So while the servants have been at work for hours in the hidden house, the family, in the grand house, wake gently into a world already made ready for them. A lady of the house wakes in a warm room, her fire already lit by a maid she did not see, hot water brought for her washing, her curtains perhaps already drawn back. A lady's maid comes to help her wash and dress, because the clothes of a woman of her class could not be managed alone, to arrange her hair, to make her ready for the day. A tray might be brought, tea, a little bread. The morning unfolds slowly and comfortably. There is no rush, because nothing in her morning requires her to hurry, and nothing requires her to do anything that a servant could do for her. The master of the house wakes to a similar ease, his valet laying out his clothes, hot water ready, the day arranged. Breakfast, when the family come down to it, is a substantial and leisurely meal, often laid out on the sideboard in covered dishes kept warm, so that the family could serve themselves at whatever hour they appeared. Eggs and bacon and kidneys and fish and cold meats and toast and preserves, a spread that had been prepared and set out by servants who had risen in the dark to make it possible. The family eat and read their letters, which have been collected and brought to them, and plan their day, a day of their own choosing, filled with whatever they wish, riding, visiting, walking the grounds, seeing to correspondence, receiving callers, the gentle occupations of people whose living was made for them by their land and their staff. And here is the quiet astonishment of it, the thing to hold as you watch the family move through their easy morning. They are, most of them, genuinely unaware of the machinery, not cruel, not deliberately blind, simply raised from birth inside a world where comfort arrived on its own, where fires were always lit, and rooms were always clean, and meals were always ready, and where the human labor that produced all of this was so thoroughly hidden by the back stairs and the early hours and the ideal of invisibility that it scarcely registered as labor at all. A child of this family grew up believing, in some deep, unexamined way, that this was simply how the world was, that houses were warm and food appeared, and clothes were clean, because they had never once seen it be otherwise, and had never seen the doing of it. The hidden life was hidden even from the people it served, perhaps especially from them. This is not to make villains of the family. They were the product of their world as much as the scullery maid was of hers. But it is the deep truth of the country house, and it is why the phrase hidden life fits it so exactly. The labor was not merely unseen by visitors or by history. It was unseen by the very people whose lives it made possible day after day, their whole lives long. They pulled the bell, and comfort came, and they no more wondered how than we wonder when we press a switch about the power stations far away. The house was built to make the labor invisible, and it succeeded so completely that the family could live their entire lives inside its results and never quite see its cause. The bell rings somewhere in the house. A footman sets down what he was doing, straightens his livery, and climbs the back stairs toward the family's world to answer it. And the day, the real working day of the house, moves into its long middle hours, when the demands come thick, and the two worlds brush against each other again and again, always on the family's terms, always by the family's bell. There is one part of the great house we have not yet visited, and it is one of the strangest of all, because it was a separate world even within the family's own world, a small kingdom of its own, high up in the house, with its own population and its own rules and its own daily life largely hidden from the grand rooms below. It was the nursery, and the way a great family raised its children tells you as much about this vanished world as anything else in the house. The children of a family like this did not, for much of their early lives, live with their parents in the way we would understand it. They lived in the nursery, a suite of rooms usually set high in the house, well away from the principal floors, and there they were raised day to day, hour to hour, not by their mother, but by servants engaged for exactly that purpose. The nursery had its own staff, presided over by the nurse or nanny, with nursemaids beneath her. And this little establishment fed the children, washed them, dressed them, played with them, disciplined them, put them to bed, and was, in the truest daily sense, the world the young child actually inhabited. A small child of this class might spend the great majority of its waking hours in the company of the nurse and the nursemaids, and comparatively little in the company of its own mother. Consider what that meant for the bond between mother and child, because it produced something that can seem to us deeply odd. The mother of the house loved her children in her way, and was concerned for them, and directed the broad shape of their upbringing. But she did not, in the main, do the raising. The children were brought to her at appointed times, cleaned and dressed, and on their best behavior, often in the later afternoon, for an hour or so in the drawing room, the children's hour, when they would be presented to their mother and perhaps their father, and would sit with them and be admired, and then be taken back up to the nursery by the nurse when the hour was over. This was, for many children of this class, the shape of their relationship with their parents, a daily visit, a scene of affection and display, and then a return to the real center of their lives, which was the nursery and the nurse. And so it happened again and again in these households that the person a child of the gentry loved most deeply, most warmly, most instinctively in all the world was not its mother, but its nurse. It was the nurse who was there in the night when the child woke frightened. It was the nurse who fed and bathed and comforted and scolded, whose lap the child climbed into, whose voice meant safety. Grown men and women of this class, looking back across their whole lives, often remembered their childhood nurse with a tenderness deeper than anything they felt for their distant, admired, but essentially ceremonial mothers. The nurse was the warmth of childhood, and the nurse was a servant, a working woman, often unmarried, who poured her care into other people's children because caring for other people's children was her employment, and who might, when those children grew up, be pensioned off, or moved to another family, or simply let go. There is a real poignancy buried here, and it is worth naming plainly, even in a calm and sleepy telling, because it is part of the hidden life too. The nurse gave a mother's love, and received a servant's wage and a servant's security, which is to say very little. She raised children who would grow up to inherit a world she could only ever serve in. The child she loved, and who loved her, would become, in time, her master or mistress, or someone like them, a person of the class above her, and the warmth of the nursery would give way to the proper distances of the adult house. And she would, perhaps, move on to another nursery, another family's children, and begin again, giving once more the deep daily love of a mother to children who were not hers and never could be, for as long as her strength lasted and her employers required her. As the children grew past infancy, the schoolroom took over from the nursery, and here another figure entered, the governess, for the girls especially, and for the younger boys. The governess taught the children their lessons, and she occupied one of the loneliest positions in the whole house because she belonged to neither world. She was educated, genteel, often from a family that had come down in the world, too refined to be treated as an ordinary servant and eat in the servants' hall, yet employed and paid and dependent, and so not a member of the family either. She fell between the two worlds of the house and belonged to neither, taking her meals often alone or with the children, respected by no one entirely. A lady by breeding and a servant by circumstance, and the isolation of her position was proverbial. She too shaped the children, taught them, was close to them daily, and remained always an outsider in the house where she lived. So the raising of the children, like everything else in the great house, was largely the work of hired hands, and the family's own children passed their earliest and most formative years in the care of women who loved them for wages, in a nursery high in the house that the parents themselves rarely entered. The child came down to the drawing room for an hour, beautifully dressed, and was loved and shown and taken away again, and went back up to the real warmth of its life, the nursery, the nurse, the hidden little kingdom under the roof. It is one more room in the house where the labor of service and the deepest human feelings were folded together and could not be separated, where genuine love and paid employment occupied the very same person and the very same hours, and where a child learned, without ever being told, that the warmth of the world came from below, and the grandeur of it from above, and that the two were somehow, bewilderingly, not the same. Let us go outside now, into the light and air, because the house was only the center of something much larger, and the hidden life extended far beyond the walls, out into the gardens and the yards and the fields, where another whole population of workers kept the estate running as a self-contained world. The great country house was not just a home. It was the head of an estate, and the estate was, in effect, a small kingdom that aimed to produce very nearly everything the house consumed, from its own land, by its own people. Start with the gardens, because a house of this standing had gardens on a scale we would now find hard to imagine, and they were not merely ornamental. There were the pleasure gardens, the lawns, and flower beds, and shrubberies that the family walked in, and that visitors admired, and these had to be kept in a state of constant, immaculate perfection, which meant an army of gardeners at work on them every day. But behind the beauty lay production. The kitchen gardens, often walled, sometimes covering acres, grew the vegetables and the fruit that fed the house, and grew them in astonishing variety and quantity, because a great table demanded fresh produce all year round. There were greenhouses and hothouses, heated through the winter, coaxing along peaches and grapes and melons and delicate flowers out of season, so that the family's table could show fruits in months when nothing should have been growing at all. The gardeners raised, tended, forced, and harvested all of this, and the head gardener, who directed them, held a position of real standing. Consider his wage, because it tells you how much the family valued what he produced. A head gardener on a grand estate could earn a very high wage indeed, in some cases as much as £100 a year, or even more, which put him above the butler, above nearly everyone in the household. Why so much? Because the gardens, like the cook's table, were part of how the family displayed itself. A visitor who saw ripe grapes in the depths of winter, or flawless flowers on every table, or a walled garden in perfect order, understood something about the wealth and the standing of the house. And the head gardener was the man who made that statement possible. Beneath him, though, the ordinary gardeners, the men and boys who did the digging and weeding and carrying and the endless labor of the grounds, earned very little, perhaps £8 to £16 a year for the younger ones. Hard outdoor work in all weathers for a wage that barely kept a person. Move on to the stables, another world of its own, with its own hierarchy. In an age of horses, a great house kept many of them, for riding, for drawing the carriages, for the work of the estate. And horses require an enormous amount of care. The stables were commanded by the coachman or the head groom, and beneath him worked grooms and stable boys, who fed and watered and groomed and exercised the horses, mucked out the stalls, cleaned and maintained the carriages and all the harness and tack, and were up early and late, because horses do not keep human hours. A stable boy might start this work as a child of 10 or so, for £6 to £12 a year, sleeping above the stables, his whole young life given over to the animals. The horses of a great house were often better housed and better fed than the boys who tended them. And that is not a figure of speech, but a plain fact of the arrangement. Then there was the gamekeeper, and his domain was the woods and coverts of the estate, where the game birds were raised and protected for the shooting that was one of the great pleasures of country life. The gamekeeper's job was to ensure that when the master and his guests went out with their guns, there were birds to shoot, and plenty of them, which meant rearing pheasants, managing the woods, feeding and protecting the birds through the year, and guarding the estate against poachers. The country people who might take a bird or a rabbit for their own pot, and who, if caught, faced the full and often harsh weight of the law. The gamekeeper earned perhaps £30 to £50 a year, and his was a position of some independence and some loneliness out on the edges of the estate, serving a sport he could never himself indulge in, raising birds for other men to shoot. And then, at the heart of the estate's economy, there was the home farm. This was the part of the estate's land kept in the family's own hands and worked directly, rather than let out to tenant farmers, and its purpose was to supply the house. The home farm kept the dairy cattle that gave the milk and cream and butter, the pigs, the poultry that laid the eggs, and provided the birds for the table, grew the hay and the grain, and produced, as far as it could, the raw food that the great house consumed in such quantity. There might be a dairymaid who milked the cows and churned the butter and tended the cheeses, farm labourers who worked the land, all of them part of the vast establishment that the house sat atop. The aim, never quite fully reached, but genuinely pursued, was self-sufficiency, a house and estate that fed themselves from their own ground, that brought in as little as possible, that stood as a complete productive world. Around all of this, beyond the home farm, lay the tenanted land, the farms let out to tenant farmers who paid rent to the estate. And it was this rent, above all, that was the true source of the family's wealth. The family did not, in the main, earn their money by any trade or profession. They owned land, a great deal of it, and other people, the tenant farmers and their labourers, worked that land and paid rent for the privilege. And from that rent, the whole establishment was funded. The house, the servants, the gardens, the horses, the leisured life, the master of the house, whatever his days of riding and shooting looked like, did have real work of a kind, the management of the estate, the overseeing of the farms and the rents and the woods and the repairs and the long, slow business of keeping a great landed property solvent and productive across the generations. It was work done from a position of enormous advantage, but it was not nothing, and a badly managed estate could decline and fall as surely as a well-managed one could endure. Here, then, is the shape of the whole thing, seen from outside the house. Picture it as a series of rings. At the centre, the family, few in number, living in leisure. Around them, the indoor servants, producing their daily comfort. Around those, the outdoor staff, the gardeners and grooms and gamekeepers, maintaining the grounds and the horses and the sport. Around those, the home farm, feeding it all. And around everything, the tenanted estate, the farms and villages whose rents paid for the entire structure, ring within ring, the whole vast apparatus arranged around the small group of people at its centre, producing their food, their comfort, their pleasures, and their income, a self-contained kingdom of land and labour with the family at its heart, living the visible, leisured, beautiful life that the whole hidden machinery existed to sustain. And most of the people in those outer rings would live and die on the estate, in its cottages, working its land, as their parents had, and their children would, tied to the great house as surely as it depended on them, come back inside now, into the middle of the day, and into a part of the hidden house we have not yet properly seen, the storerooms and the still room, and the whole apparatus by which a great house kept itself supplied. Because feeding and provisioning an establishment of this size was not a matter of a daily trip to a shop. It was a continuous operation of storage and preservation and accounting, run largely by the housekeeper, and it turned the working half of the house into something like a warehouse and a small factory as much as a home. Think first of the sheer scale of what had to be kept. A house feeding perhaps 40 people every day, family and servants together, and feeding them well, and being ready at any time to feed guests as well, needed reserves, and lots of them. There were storerooms for the dry goods, the flour and sugar and rice and dried fruit and spices, bought in bulk and kept under lock. There was the larder, cool and stone-floored, where the fresh meat and game and butter and milk were kept as long as they could be kept in an age before refrigeration. There was the cellar for the wine and the beer, much of the beer brewed on the estate or bought in by the barrel, because servants as well as family drank beer daily, and it was often part of their allowance. And there was the still room, a particular and interesting place, the housekeeper's own domain, where the finer preserving and preparing went on, the making of jams and jellies and preserves, the potting and bottling, the preparation of cakes and biscuits and delicate things, the storing of the household's medicines and cordials. The still-room maid worked here under the housekeeper, and it was a step above the rough work of the scullery, a place of skill and relative cleanliness. All of this had to be managed, and the managing of it was one of the housekeeper's great responsibilities, and it came down, in the end, to the keys. She held the keys to the storerooms and the cupboards, and nothing came out of them except through her, and everything that came out was, ideally, accounted for. This was not mere fussiness. A great house was a place of great consumption, and therefore great opportunity for waste and for theft, and a household that did not keep careful account of its stores could bleed money quietly and steadily. So the housekeeper kept her books, recording what was used, checking it against what had been bought, guarding the stores against the pilfering that was a constant temptation to underpaid servants surrounded by plenty. She was, in effect, the quartermaster of the house, and a good one saved the family a great deal of money without their ever knowing quite how. There is a whole economy here worth pausing on, because it reveals something about how these houses actually worked as financial concerns. The family were rich in land and in the style of their living, but ready money was often tighter than the grandeur suggested, and a great house was fearfully expensive to run. The wages of dozens of servants, the feeding of all of them, the upkeep of the house and gardens and stables, the coal, the candles and lamp oil, the endless repairs, all of this added up to a very large annual outgoing, and it had to be met year after year out of the estate's income. This is why the careful management of the household mattered so much, why the housekeeper's accounts and the guarding of the stores and the pursuit of self-sufficiency were not trivial. A great house was always, in a sense, a business running close enough to its margins that waste was a real enemy, and the whole hidden apparatus of storerooms and accounts and locked cupboards existed to keep the enormous machine of the family's life from consuming more than the estate could provide. Now, at midday, pause the provisioning and come to the servant's own dinner, because it is one of the most revealing scenes in the whole house, and we have earned a proper look at it. In the middle of the day, the servants took their main meal, in the servants' hall, all of them together, or nearly all, and here the hidden society showed itself most plainly. The long table, the butler at one end, the housekeeper at the other, presiding like a father and mother over a very large and very ranked family. The food served in strict order of precedence, the upper servants first, then down the ranks to the youngest, who were served last and ate quickest because there was always work waiting. The lower servants waited on the upper ones even here, even at their own dinner. And the food itself was plain, but generally plentiful, because a well-run house fed its servants adequately, understanding that hungry servants worked badly and left. So there was meat and bread and beer and vegetables from the gardens, the same gardens that supplied the family's finer table. And then, in many houses, the moment that captured the whole arrangement, partway through the meal, when the main course was done, the upper servants would rise, the butler and the housekeeper and the cook and the lady's maid and the valet, and they would withdraw, taking their pudding and their dignity with them to the housekeeper's room. there to finish their meal in the superior comfort of their own company, away from the lower servants. The room they withdrew to even had its own half-joking name in some houses, spoken of as a place as exclusive, in its way, as any grand drawing room. The lower servants stayed at the long table and finished their dinner among themselves. It was a hierarchy within a hierarchy, a class system operating inside the class of servants, and it was observed as seriously as anything upstairs, because for these people, precedence was one of the few possessions they had, and they held to it. Let this scene stand for the whole strange truth of the hidden life, because it holds so much of it at once. Here are people at the very bottom of the wider world, servants, many of them poor country children, who went into service because there was nothing else, sitting at their own dinner in the middle of a long working day. And even here, even among themselves, they reproduce the exact structure of rank and deference that governs the world above them. The scullery maid serves the head housemaid. The head housemaid defers to the housekeeper. The housekeeper rises and withdraws in state. The whole society below stairs is a perfect small mirror of the society above, with its own aristocracy and its own labouring poor, its own dignities and its own drudgery, folded invisibly into the working half of a house whose owners are, at that same hour, taking a leisurely luncheon in a beautiful room upstairs, entirely unaware that beneath their feet a whole separate civilization is sitting down to dinner and observing, with perfect seriousness, its own elaborate rules of rank. The servants' dinner ends. The upper servants return from their withdrawing room. The lower servants rise, and the bells are already beginning again, because the family's afternoon is starting. And the afternoon in a great house brought its own demands, its callers and its teas and its preparations for the evening, all of which fell, as everything fell, on the people of the hidden house. Back to work, then. The long day is not half over. Let us pause the day for a while and look at the physical fabric of the house itself. The actual machinery of light and warmth and water that a great house needed to function, because the comfort the family enjoyed depended on systems that we would find astonishingly laborious, and every one of them meant work for somebody. Begin with light, because light is the thing we take most for granted, and the Victorians could not. In 1885, in a country house, there was no electric light, or almost none, that technology being still new and rare and confined mostly to a few wealthy pioneers in the towns. The great house was lit, as houses had been lit for centuries, by fire, which is to say by candles and by oil lamps, and lighting a large house this way was a continuous daily labour. Consider the lamps. Oil lamps gave the best domestic light of the age, but they were needy things. Every lamp had to be filled with oil, its wick trimmed to burn cleanly, its glass chimney cleaned of the soot it inevitably gathered, and this had to be done to every lamp in use, every day. In a great house, there might be dozens of lamps, and the cleaning and filling and trimming of them was a daily task, often given to a particular servant. Hours of fiddling, sooty work so that the rooms could glow softly in the evening, and candles besides, the good wax candles for the family's rooms, expensive enough that their use was watched, set in their holders, lit and snuffed and replaced. The golden evening light that made the drawing room so lovely was itself a thing of labour filled and trimmed and carried and lit by hands you never saw. Now water, which is even more startling to us, because in most of these houses, through most of this period, there was no running water to the rooms as we know it, and certainly no hot water on demand. Water had to be carried. Think about what that meant in a house where the family washed and bathed and expected hot water for both. Every drop of hot water for a lady's morning wash, for a gentleman's shave, for a bath, had to be heated below, in the kitchen or a boiler, and then carried in cans up the stairs, the back stairs to the bedrooms, by servants, and the used water, and the waste had to be carried back down again. A bath, a full hot bath, was therefore a considerable undertaking. Cans and cans of hot water carried up from below to fill a tub brought into the bedroom or dressing room. And then, when the bath was done, all that water bailed and carried down again. The housemaid's arms and backs knew the true weight of the family's cleanliness. What comes to us instantly and effortlessly from a tap came to them carried up flights of stairs in heavy cans, many times a day, every day, and this alone, the carrying of water, was a great and constant part of the hidden labor of the house. And warmth, which we have touched on, but which deserves its full weight here, because warmth in a great house meant coal, and coal meant an astonishing quantity of heavy, dirty, physical work. Every one of those open fires, in every room, burned coal, and the coal had to be got to the fires, which meant it had to be carried, in scuttles and hods, from the coal store to every grate in the house, up the stairs, along the passages, replenished through the day as the fires burned down. A large house in the colder months burned a truly enormous amount of coal, tons of it, and moving all that coal about the house, up from the cellars to the rooms, was relentless labor, mostly done by the lower servants. And it was filthy labor, blackening the hands and the clothes, and everything it touched, which is one reason the servants who did it were kept so carefully out of the family's sight. The warmth that wrapped the family so comfortably was carried to them, lump by lump, up the back stairs, by people who then knelt in the cold early dark to build it into fire. Step back and see what all of this means together, because it changes how you understand the word comfort. When we speak of the comfort of a great Victorian house, we picture warmth and light and cleanliness and ease, and all of that was really there. The family really did live in warm, softly lit, clean, comfortable rooms. But every element of that comfort was, in that age, the direct product of human muscle, performed continuously and invisibly. The warmth was coal carried and fires tended. The light was lamps filled and trimmed and candles lit. The hot water was heated below and carried up and carried down. The cleanliness was hours on hands and knees. There was no system, no machinery, no infrastructure doing this work in the background, as there is for us. The infrastructure was people. The house ran on human bodies the way a later house would run on electricity and plumbing, and the bodies were housed in the attics and paid a few pounds a year and asked to be invisible. This is perhaps the deepest reason the country house needed so many servants, a number that can seem, at first, absurd. 30 or 40 people to look after a family of a handful. It was not extravagance for its own sake, though there was status in a great staff. It was that the actual physical maintenance of a large, warm, well-lit, clean, well-fed house in an age before the machines that now do this work, simply required that many hands. Every comfort had its human cost in labor, and a great many comforts, sustained every day, required a great many laborers. The size of the hidden staff was the exact measure of the comfort of the visible family, because in that age comfort could be measured in nothing but human hours, and the family's comfort was very large, and so, necessarily, was the number of people spending their lives to produce it. So when you look again at the warm, glowing, effortless evening rooms of the family, see them now for what they physically were, an achievement of carried coal and trimmed lamps and heated water and swept floors, a comfort with no machinery behind it, but people, sustained by an army of hands moving unseen through the house from before dawn to after dark. The magic of the comfortable house was not magic. It was labor, all the way down. And now that you can see the labor, you can never quite see the magic in the same way again. The afternoon in a great country house had a rhythm of its own, gentler than the morning's heavy labor, but no less governed by ritual. And it is worth following, because it shows the two worlds touching each other in their most characteristic way, through the small ceremonies of a leisured life that only servants made possible. In the afternoon, the family received, or paid, calls, the ritual of the social call, so central to this whole society, ran in the country as it did in town, though the distances were greater and the pace a little slower. Ladies of neighboring families would drive over in their carriages to call and be received in the drawing room, and take tea, and exchange the careful, pleasant conversation that maintained the web of connection among the county families. Or the lady of the house would go out to call in her turn, driven by the coachman, attended as she needed to be. And each of these calls, simple as it looked, set the hidden house in motion. The carriage had to be made ready, the horses harnessed, the coachman turned out in his proper dress, which meant the stable staff had been at work. The drawing room had to be immaculate, which meant the housemaids had been at work. And when tea was called for, a whole small ceremony descended into action below stairs. Afternoon tea deserves a moment, because it was one of the loveliest of the family's rituals, and one of the most revealing of the labor beneath. The delicate business of tea, the fine china brought out and arranged, the teapot and the hot water, the thin bread and butter, the cakes and the little sandwiches, the whole graceful spread appearing on a low table in the drawing room in the late afternoon, was the product of real work by several people. The still-room maid or the cook had made the cakes. A maid had prepared the tray with the correct china. Everything just so. A footman or a maid had carried it up at the right moment and arranged it. The kettle had been kept hot on a range that a kitchen maid had lit before dawn, and all of it appeared, as everything appeared in this house, as if by itself, set down before the family and their guests with a quiet word, and then left, the servant withdrawing, so that the ladies could pour and pass and chat in a scene of perfect leisure that rested, like every scene in the house, on hands that had made it ready, and then disappeared. Let us slow down here and think honestly about the relationships across the great divide of the house, because it would be too simple to imagine only coldness between the two worlds, and the truth was more tangled and more human than that. Between family and servants, there could be, and often was, real feeling of a particular and complicated kind. A lady's maid, who dressed her mistress every day for years, who knew her clothes and her moods and her small vanities and troubles, could become genuinely close to her, a confidant of a sort, trusted with intimacies, valued, even loved, in a way, though always across a gap that never quite closed. A cook who had fed a family for decades, a housekeeper who had held the house through the raising of the children, a nurse whom the children loved more warmly, sometimes, than they loved their own often distant mother. These were real bonds, real attachments, and to pretend they did not exist would be to miss much of what the house actually felt like to live in. And yet the bond, however real, was never a bond between equals, and both sides knew it, always. The servant might be trusted, valued, even loved, but the servant could also be dismissed, a servant who displeased, who grew too old, who fell ill, who was suspected of some fault, could be let go, and a servant let go without a good character, without the reference from their employer that was the passport to any future position, could be ruined, cast out of the only livelihood they knew, with nothing to fall back on. The affection was real, and the power was real, and the power was entirely on one side. A lady might weep to lose a maid who married and left, and mean it, and the same lady held, without ever having to think about it, the absolute power to turn that maid out of the house at a word. That is the texture of these relationships, warmth and dependence and genuine feeling, all of it resting on a foundation of total inequality that neither party could forget, because the whole house was built to remind them of it at every hour. Consider it from the servant's side, which history so rarely troubles to do. A young housemaid, perhaps 15 or 16, from a poor country family, sent into service because it was the expected path, and because one less mouth at home was a relief, finds herself living in a great house among people whose wealth is beyond her imagining, dressing them, cleaning for them, serving them, close to their lives every day, and yet utterly separate from them. She sleeps in a bare attic. She rises in the dark. She is expected to be invisible. And around her, all day, is a beauty and a comfort and an abundance that is not for her, that she maintains but never shares. The warm rooms she cannot sit in, the fine food she cannot eat, the ease she creates and is excluded from. What did she feel moving through those beautiful rooms with her dustpan in the early morning, kneeling at those fires? We cannot fully know, because such people left few records, but it would be a strange heart that felt nothing, that did not know, at some level, the vast unfairness of the arrangement, even in an age that told her it was natural and ordained and right. And here is a fact worth holding, because it complicates any simple picture. By these very years, the 1880s, this whole world was beginning, very slowly, to feel the first tremors of change. The great age of domestic service was at its height, but cracks were appearing. Servants were becoming harder to keep, harder to satisfy. Young people, especially, were beginning to find that the growing towns and factories, for all their hardship, offered something service did not, which was freedom, an evening that was your own, a life outside another family's walls, wages you could spend as you liked without a mistress watching. The old certainty that service was simply the natural destiny of the poor was beginning here and there to be questioned. And some of the sharpest questioning came from the servants themselves. The house we are standing in, so seemingly eternal, so fixed in its ranks and rituals, was in fact near the end of its long day, though no one living in it could quite see that yet. Within a generation or two, this entire way of life, the great staff, the hidden kingdom, the whole vast apparatus of the country house would begin to fall away, and much of it would be gone. But not yet. Tonight it is 1885, and the house is at the full height of its powers, and the afternoon is turning toward evening, and the greatest performance of the day is about to be prepared, because in a few hours the family will dine, and the dinner of a great house was the summit of the whole day's labor, the moment when the hidden machinery worked at its hardest to produce, for an hour or two, a scene of flawless, effortless splendor. Let us go and watch it made. We have spent so much of tonight below stairs and behind the scenes that we should, in fairness, spend a while properly in the family's world too, out in the open air of it, because the leisured life of the country gentry had its own real substance, its own occupations and pleasures, and understanding them completes the picture of what the whole vast establishment was actually for. The great pursuit of country life, the one that shaped the calendar and the landscape, and a good part of the estate's whole purpose, was field sport, and above all, shooting. When the season came, the master of the house and his guests would go out with their guns after the game birds that the gamekeeper had spent all year rearing and protecting. And a shooting party was one of the central social events of country life, an occasion that could draw guests from far away to stay in the house for days at a time. On a shooting day, the gentlemen would go out into the coverts and the fields, and beaters, local men and boys hired for the day, would move through the woods, driving the birds up into the air toward the waiting guns, and the shooting would go on through the day, and the bag, the count of birds taken, would be totted up at the end, sometimes running to remarkable numbers on a well-stocked estate. Follow the labor behind even this, the family's purest pleasure, because it was considerable. The whole event rested on the gamekeeper's year of work, the rearing and feeding and guarding of the birds, so that there would be enough of them to make a good day's sport. It rested on the beaters and the loaders and the keepers who managed the day itself. It rested, when the guns came back, on the kitchen, which would have to deal with the game, and on the still room and the larder, and on the servants who would prepare and serve the large dinners that followed a day's shooting, when the party, tired and pleased, would gather to eat and drink and relive the day. A shooting party was a pleasure for the few, and a great labor for the many, like everything else in this world, and the birds that fell to the guests' guns had been raised at real cost and effort, precisely so that they could fall. The ladies of the house had their own occupations, gentler than the guns, but no less part of the fabric of country life. There was riding, for those who cared for it, out through the parkland, and the lanes on horses the grooms had readied. There was walking in the gardens and the grounds, those beautiful grounds the gardeners kept in perfect order. There was the visiting and the receiving of callers that we have already seen, the maintenance of the whole web of county society. There was the management of the house itself, which for the mistress was a real and daily occupation. The overseeing of the housekeeper and the cook, the planning of meals and entertainments, the settling of the household's small daily questions. A genuine managerial role, even if it was one conducted from above, through the upper servants. Rather than hands-on, there was correspondence, and reading, and music, and needlework, and the charitable visiting of the estate's poorer families that was expected of a lady of the manor, the taking of soup or comforts to a sick tenant, the small noblesse of the great house toward the village that depended on it. That relationship with the village and the tenantry is worth a moment, because it was a real part of how these families understood themselves and their place. A great landed family did not see itself, in the main, as merely wealthy people enjoying their wealth. It saw itself as occupying a position with duties attached, as the head of a whole rural community, responsible in some loose but genuinely felt way for the welfare of the people on its land. The family attended the parish church, often in their own pew at the front, and the estate's people filled the rest. The family might support the village school, or the church, or help a tenant family through a hard season, or provide for old servants who could no longer work. This was not equality, and it was not charity in any systematic sense, and it existed comfortably alongside the hard fact that these same families lived in enormous ease off the rents of people who lived in cottages. But it was real. The sense of duty, the paternal idea that the great house looked after its own, and it softened the edges of the arrangement and helped everyone, above and below, to feel that the whole structure was not merely exploitation, but something more like a natural order in which each rank had its place and its obligations. The rhythm of the country year shaped all of this. Country life followed the seasons and the calendar of sport and society, the shooting in its months, the hunting in its season, the great house filling with guests for a shooting party, or emptying when the family went up to London for the social season in the spring, then returning to the country for the summer and autumn. The house breathed in and out across the year, full and quiet, busy and still, and the servants' work rose and fell with it, easier when the family were away, punishing when the house was full of guests and every bedroom was occupied and every meal was a banquet. A house party, with its extra guests each bringing their own personal servants, could swell the population of the house enormously and drive the staff to their absolute limit. And these great gatherings were the peaks of effort in the servants' year, the times when the hidden machinery ran hottest to sustain the visible splendor at its most splendid. So the family's life was not empty, and it would be wrong to leave you thinking the people upstairs merely idled while the people downstairs merely toiled. The family's days were full of real occupation, sport and society, and the management of a great estate and the duties of their position. And much of it mattered, and some of it was even hard in its way. But it was occupation of a wholly different order from the labor below, chosen rather than compelled, pleasant rather than punishing, cushioned at every point by service, and undertaken from a position of such advantage that even its duties were a kind of privilege. The gentleman managing his estate, and the housemaid carrying his coal, were both, you might say, working. But between the two kinds of working lay the entire distance of the age, and the whole house was built to maintain that distance, and to make the one kind of life float, effortlessly and beautifully, on the other. As the light begins to lengthen, and the afternoon cools toward evening, the whole house tilts toward the one event that everything else has, in a sense, been leading to. The family will dine, and the dinner of a great country house was not a meal, in the way we mean a meal. It was a performance, a nightly production of considerable complexity, requiring the coordinated labor of much of the staff, and it deserves to be watched from both sides at once, the calm above and the controlled storm below, because nowhere else does the gap between the two worlds show so completely. Begin below in the kitchen, where the pressure has been building all afternoon. The cook has been planning and preparing this dinner since the morning, when the menu was settled, often in consultation with the mistress of the house, who would come down or send word about what was wanted, especially if there were guests. A dinner of several courses, and a formal dinner in a house like this ran to many courses, soup and fish and meats and game and sweet dishes and savories. Each course itself, sometimes several dishes, meant hours of work, and as the dining hour approached, the kitchen became a place of heat and speed and exacting effort. The range roared. Pots and pans covered every surface. The cook directed her maids with the sharp authority of a commander in battle, because everything had to be ready at once, hot, perfect, and timed to the family's sitting down, and a dinner spoiled or delayed reflected on her, and could not be allowed. The scullery maid, meanwhile, faced the mounting tide of used pans and dishes that would only grow through the evening. Her hands raw in the hot, greasy water, scouring without pause. The kitchen at the dinner hour was the hardest working place in the entire house, a scene of real strain and real skill, hidden away at the back and below, producing beauty out of sweat. Above, in the dining room, a different kind of preparation. The footmen, under the butler's direction, have laid the table, and the laying of a great table was itself an art. The white cloth, the ranks of silver, each piece polished to a shine, the glasses for the different wines, the china, the flowers, the candles or the lamps, everything placed by rule and measured, sometimes literally, for exactness. The butler has been to the cellar and chosen and prepared the wines for the evening, decanting what needed decanting, and the wine was his particular responsibility and his particular pride. The room has been made warm and beautiful, the fire lit, the light soft and golden. It waits perfect and empty for the family to enter. Then the family dress for dinner, because one did not dine in the clothes one had worn all day. This was itself a labor that fell on the servants, the lady's maid, and the valet, attending their mistress and master, helping them into evening dress, the elaborate gowns, and the black formal clothes that the dinner of a great house required, even when the family dined alone, because the standards were kept up whether or not there was anyone to see. The dressing for dinner being one of those rituals by which the family reminded themselves of who they were. And so, freshly dressed, the family come down at the appointed hour into the beautiful waiting room and take their places at the gleaming table, and the performance begins. Watch how it runs, because the smoothness of it is the whole point and the whole illusion. the family sit and are served, and from their side the dinner unfolds as an unbroken procession of excellent food and wine, appearing and being cleared, and reappearing as the next course, the plates warm, the glasses filled, everything arriving at the right moment and vanishing at the right moment. All of it accomplished by the footman moving quietly around the table, under the butler's near invisible direction. A word here, a glance there, the whole service choreographed so that the family need never wait, never ask twice, never see anything but a flawless flow of plenty. They talk and eat and drink, and the dinner serves itself around them, or seems to. Now see what that smoothness cost in the same minutes, just out of sight. Every dish that appears so calmly on the table has just come, hot and urgent, from the roaring kitchen, carried at speed by a servant up from the working part of the house, because in many of these houses the kitchen was set well away from the dining room, sometimes deliberately, so that the smells of cooking would not reach the family, which meant the food had to be carried a considerable distance and still arrive hot, a small race run over and over through the evening. The footmen move between the serene dining room and the frantic kitchen, crossing in a few steps from one world to the other and back, from the golden calm of the table to the heat and shouting of the range, wearing on their faces in the dining room nothing but smooth attentiveness, whatever chaos they had just stepped out of. The butler holds the whole thing together, the timing, the wine, the sequence, the correction of any small fault before it becomes visible, and below, the cook and her maids drive the courses out one after another, and the scullery maid's mountain of dishes grows, and the labour reaches its peak precisely at the moment when, upstairs, the leisure reaches its peak too. The two worlds are never further apart than at dinner, and never more tightly connected. The hardest work in the house, producing the purest ease in the house, separated by a few steps and an entire universe. And when the meal moves toward its end, another small ritual that tells you everything. The ladies withdraw, leaving the gentlemen to their wine, and later the whole family retire to the drawing room for the evening, for coffee, for music perhaps, for conversation, for the gentle close of the day. And the servants, whose evening is not close at all, begin the long work of clearing, the table stripped, the vast wreckage of the dinner carried down, the washing up that would go on late into the night, the silver counted and put away by the butler, the dining room set to rights, the drawing room attended to, the coffee made and carried up, the fires kept in, the family waited on to the last. The family's day is winding down into ease. The servants' day still has hours to run, because the servants could not go to bed until the family did, and often not until well after, and the family were in no hurry. Here, at the dinner, is the country house entire, compressed into a single evening. The visible splendour and the hidden labour, the leisure and the work, the served and the serving, all of it running at once, joined and divided. The whole meaning of the house laid out on a single gleaming table, and in the single roaring kitchen beneath it. If you understood nothing else about how these houses worked, you could understand it all from one formal dinner, from the flawless calm above and the desperate effort below, and the few quiet footmen crossing endlessly between them, carrying plenty up and emptiness down, keeping the two worlds forever apart and forever, invisibly, 1. The candles burn low. The family rise from the table and drift toward the drawing room and the soft end of their evening. And down in the kitchen, the scullery maid looks at what is still to be washed and settles in, because for her the night is far from over. The evening deepens, and the house begins, at last, its long, slow descent into night, though the descent is far gentler for some of its inhabitants than for others. In the drawing room, the family pass the last hours of the day in exactly the kind of ease the whole house exists to provide. There might be music, one of the daughters at the piano, the sound drifting through the warm room. There might be reading, or cards, or quiet talk, or needlework by lamplight. The fire burns low and is quietly built up again by a servant who comes and goes. It is the loveliest part of the family's day, this unhurried evening, nothing required of them, the labor of the world held entirely at bay, and they sit in the golden light and let the day close around them softly. And somewhere not far away, through a door, down a passage, the other house is still working. The washing up from that great dinner is a labor of hours, and it falls, most of it, on the lowest and youngest, the scullery maid above all, standing at her sink in the dim kitchen long after the meal is a memory upstairs, working through the pots and the pans and the plates and the endless glasses, her feet aching, her hands ruined, the water going cold and being changed and going cold again. The kitchen must be left clean and ready for the morning, because the morning's work would begin before dawn, and there was no time then to deal with the night's mess. So she works on, while above her the music plays, and there is no unfairness she could point to that the age would have recognized as unfairness, because this was simply how things were, and she had known it would be so when she came, and there was nowhere else for a girl like her to go. Through the house, the other servants move through the closing rituals of the day. The housemaids go up ahead of the family to prepare the bedrooms, to turn down the beds, to make up the bedroom fires so the rooms would be warm when the family came up, to set out what was needed for the night, to fill the cans of hot water for the last washing of the day. The lady's maid and the valet wait because they cannot go to bed until their mistress and master do, since the undressing was as much their work as the dressing had been. The footmen see to the last of the evening's needs, the drinks, the fires, the doors, and everywhere the principle holds that governed the whole day, the servant's time belongs to the family until the family release it, and the family, deep in their comfortable evening, are in no hurry to release anyone. The butler, meanwhile, performs one of the day's most important rituals, the securing of the house for the night. He sees the silver safely put away and locked up, that valuable silver he was responsible for, counted and stored. He attends to the wine cellar, locked. And he goes about the great house, locking the doors and seeing to the windows, making the building fast against the dark, because a large house full of valuables standing in the isolated countryside had to be shut up carefully each night. And this was the butler's charge, the last responsible act of his long day. In some houses, a footman slept near the silver or the plate to guard it. The house that had been, all day, a place of openness and coming and going, of tradesmen and callers and the endless traffic of work, became at night a sealed and guarded thing, locked and dark at its edges, with only the warm heart of it, the drawing room, still glowing. At last the family tire and rise and take their candles and go up to bed, up the grand staircase to the warm rooms the housemaids have made ready, and the great releasing begins. Now the lady's maid can undress her mistress and brush out her hair and be finished. Now the valet can see to his master. Now, one by one, as the family settle into their warm beds in their firelit rooms, the servants who have waited on them can finally be done, and climb themselves. The other staircase, the back stairs, up past the good floors where the family sleep, up to the bare attics under the roof, where their own hard, narrow beds waited. The last to finish, very often, were the lowest. The scullery maid still at her sink, the kitchen maid setting the last things ready for a morning only a few hours off, and then even they, at last, climbed up to the cold attic rooms and lay down for a few hours before the whole thing began again in the dark. Think about the shape of that day, now that we have followed it all the way through, from the first fire lit before dawn to the last dish washed near midnight. The family's day was perhaps 10 or 12 waking hours of chosen, pleasant activity, cushioned at every point by service. The servants' day, for the lowest of them, ran from before the family woke to after the family slept, 16 hours or more of labor, most of it heavy, all of it in the service of others, bounded not by their own needs, but by the needs of the few people at the center of the house. And this was not one hard day among easy ones. This was every day, most of the year, with a rare half-day off, a rare afternoon, the occasional grudged holiday, but in the main, an unbroken succession of such days, for years, for a whole working life, from the time a child of 12 or 14 went into service until age or marriage or illness took them out of it. And the house held all of this, the ease and the labor, the sleep of the family in their warm rooms, and the shorter sleep of the servants under the slates, within the same walls, on the same night, as it had held it every night for generations, and would hold it, though none of them knew it, for only a little while longer. The great house at night, seen from outside across the dark park, showed a few warm lights, and then went dark, and looked like peace itself, like the most settled and permanent thing in the world. Inside, it was two worlds sleeping under one roof, having spent the day as far apart as two worlds could be while sharing a single building, and about to wake and do it all again. Let the house go quiet now. Let the last light in the kitchen go out. Let the family sleep in their warm rooms and the servants in their cold ones, and let the great building stand dark and silent in the night, its long day of hidden labor finally, briefly done. There is only the closing reflection left, and then you too can let the whole vanished world go and sleep. We have been through the whole house now, from the attics to the cellars, from the drawing room to the scullery, from the family at their leisure to the scullery maid at her sink. And before we let it all fade into the dark, let us hold the whole thing in view one last time, honestly, without softening it and without hardening it either. The competence was real. Begin there, because it is easily lost. The people who ran this house were, many of them, superbly good at what they did. The cook who could send up a flawless dinner of many courses hot and perfect and on time, night after night, was a genuine artist and a formidable manager. The housekeeper, who held the whole complex economy of the house in her head and her account books, who kept dozens of people and countless stores in order, was running an operation that would tax a capable person in any age. The butler, with his cellar and his silver and his choreographed service, the head gardener coaxing fruit from the winter, the lady's maid with her 100 skills, even the housemaid who could clean and lay and light a fire in the cold dark with speed and silence. All of these were real skills, hard won, often taking years to master, and the people who held them had every right to the pride they took in them. The hidden house was not a place of mere drudgery. It was a place of craft, of expertise, of genuine human accomplishment. And much of the beauty of the visible house was, in truth, the achievement of the invisible one. And the injustice was real too, and naming the skill does not soften it. These skilled, capable people worked longer hours than the family could have imagined enduring, for wages that were a rounding error in the household accounts, and slept in cold, bare rooms above the warm ones they maintained, and were asked to be invisible in the very house their labor created. They did not own what they made. They made comfort and lived without it. They made beauty and were kept at its edges. They produced, with their own hands, a whole world of ease and plenty, and were permitted to inhabit only its underside, its back stairs, and its attics, and its working rooms, moving through the beautiful house as ghosts move, present and unseen. The very design of the building, its hidden passages, and its separate stairs, was an architecture of exclusion, built to ensure that the people who made the house run would not be seen to do it. That was not an accident of the age. It was the age's intention, expressed in stone. Hold both of those together, because the house was both, always, at once. It was a triumph of human skill and a monument to human inequality, and neither of those cancels the other. The scullery maid's raw hands and the cook's perfect dinner were the same house. The warm bedroom and the cold attic above it were the same house. The family sleeping in comfort, and the servants who had made that comfort and then climbed past their door to colder rooms were the same house on the same night. And to see the country house truly is to see all of that at once, and to refuse the easy comfort of seeing only the beauty or only the cruelty. It was made of both. It could not have existed without both. There is a particular thing worth saying about invisibility, because it was the deepest cruelty of the arrangement, and the quietest. To be poor is one thing, and hard enough. To be made unseen is another thing on top of it, and it is a strange one. The servants of the great house were not merely paid little and worked hard. They were asked to erase themselves, to do their labor, and leave no trace of the doing, to turn to the wall when the family passed, to move through the house by hidden ways, so that the family need never be reminded that the comfort around them was made by human hands. They were present everywhere and acknowledged nowhere. And there is something in that, in being asked not just to serve but to vanish, that reaches past mere hardship into something that touches the dignity of a person at its root. The girl who lit the fire was real. She had a name, a family, a history, hopes of her own, a whole inner life as full as anyone's, and the house was arranged, gently, thoroughly, without malice, to ensure that none of that would ever have to be noticed by the people she served. She warmed their rooms, and she was not to be seen doing it. That was the bargain, and it was a heavy one, heavier in some ways than the labor itself. And yet the record is not wholly silent, and that is worth holding on to as a small light. Here and there, a few of these families did notice, did care, did leave some trace of the people who served them. There were houses where old servants were kept on and provided for when they could no longer work, where portraits of long-serving housekeepers and butlers hung on the walls, where the names and faces of the staff were recorded and remembered with real affection. These were the exceptions, and they do not undo the structure, but they are real too, and they remind us that within even this arrangement, ordinary human warmth found its way through, that some masters saw their servants as people, and some servants gave real loyalty in return, and that the whole thing was lived, in the end, not by categories, but by individuals, each doing their best inside a world none of them had made. This is not, in the end, a story with villains, and it is not a story that lets anyone off. The family were not monsters. Most of them were ordinary people, born into a position they did not choose, raised to believe it natural, genuinely fond, often of the servants who surrounded them, and no more able to see the whole structure they sat atop than a fish can see water. The servants were not simply victims. Many took real pride in their work and real place in their world, climbed its ladder, valued its securities, and would not have recognized themselves in a picture that painted them only as the oppressed. The truth is quieter and harder than villains and victims. It is simply a structure, a way of arranging human beings that gave ease to a few by taking the labor of many, and hid the taking so well that it could pass to almost everyone inside it as the natural order of the world. That structure was real, and it shaped millions of lives, and it has very nearly vanished. And it is worth understanding exactly because it looks at first glance like nothing but grace. The house is dark now. The family sleep in their warm rooms. The servants sleep in their cold ones. The fires have burned down to embers. The silver is locked away. The doors are fast, and the great building stands silent in the dark park, holding its two worlds, as it has held them all through this long night. Tomorrow, before dawn, a girl will wake in the attic and go down in the cold to light the first fire, and the whole hidden life will begin again, as it began every day, unseen, unthanked, and for a while longer, unquestioned. But that is tomorrow. Tonight, there is only the quiet and the dark, and the great house asleep at last, its labor done, its lights out, its long day over. Let it rest. Let the whole vanished world of it rest. And let yourself now rest too, and drift, and let the house and the night and everything in it go softly quiet and dark and still.